the voluntary carbon market it's basically the Wild West in a way. It's no, and I don't think any government would be able to look at this for too long without putting some regulatory framework around it.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Today is a very special episode as we will be diving into the legal aspects of the voluntary carbon market with our guest, Peter Mayer, who is a New York City-based attorney, partner, and business advisor. Peter has 20 years of experience working in big law and specializes in carbon removals, which is very rare, if I may say so. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I'm really excited for this opportunity to get your unique perspective on what it's like to facilitate carbon credit purchases from a legal standpoint. But before we dive headfirst into that, I would certainly like to hear about your background and how on earth you ended up in this very niche industry.
Well, thank you very much, Violet, for having me on the show. This is my first podcast ever, so I'm very excited about it. I've been listening to your episodes you're broadcasting for a while, and I like the format. You got great people on the show, so I'm really glad to be here. So my background is I'm a transactional attorney, born and raised in Germany. I started practicing law in Germany about 20 years ago. I always had an affinity to the energy sector. I did a lot of work in the renewable space, wind and solar predominantly. My first interaction with the carbon market was 2005 when the emission trading systems came into play as a pilot project back then. And then about 10 years ago, I moved to New York for a big, was part of it back then at a big international firm. And about 5 years ago, I started my own practice with a few friends of mine. So a lot of work in the energy space, and with respect to the carbon market or carbon removal market, even more specific, my first interaction with that was about 3 years ago when I met Hannes Junglinger from Carbon Future in New York. We're both German. He happened to be in New York that week. We met up for a cup of coffee, sort of liked each other. They engaged me with respect to the U.S. Expansion. And since then, it has ever grown. The carbon market business for me, Carbon Future was my first client, and now I would say it's about 80% of the work that I do is in the carbon removal space.
Thank you for sharing. Now, without further ado, I guess I'd like to ask the simple question of why are contracts so important in the VCM?
Right. So the voluntary carbon market, there's no specific regulation. So all transactions in the space, it's all contracts. That's all we have. That's all we can rely on. Buyers and sellers coming together on a marketplace, buying and selling credits. And the only legal framework that we really have are contracts between the parties that are active in this space. The challenge that we have is that, unlike in other industries, there are really no standardized models. If you have a financing round for a startup, you know exactly what this documentation is going to look like. That's all standardized. But when you buy carbon credits, you don't really quite know how this contract is going to look like. Everyone's using a different format, different template. It's very different even from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So what we're trying to do here is we help our clients develop templates that they can use for their transactions, so that they don't need to reinvent the wheel every time. That works reasonably well, but sometimes, especially since we mainly work with suppliers here and project developers, when they have a bigger buyer, then the buyer comes in with his own template and says that's the kind of agreement we would like to use. And they look different all the time. Everyone uses a different format and a different kind of agreement. There are obviously similarities, but you got to sort of pay attention every time to what's the contents of the agreement. That makes it both challenging, but also intellectually just very stimulating, in the sense that you always need to, you feel like you're participating or contributing to building something really from the ground up, basically, since there are no established models out there.
Peter, this is such a fascinating topic to me because we hear about a lot about how this company bought this many credits and those companies struck a deal for this many tons of removals, but we really don't know much beyond that. So I'm really dying to know from your experience, what can you share with us about structuring carbon credit deals?
Right. I mean, yeah, that's really, it's really fascinating for me also to read and learn about those deals, participate in those deals and contributing to them. And we always talk a lot about policy in this space and technologies, which is truly fascinating. So I'm glad that I can share a little bit of the legal perspective as well, which I think is just so incredibly important. Also it's just a very important underpinning for this market, that it is able to grow and to scale. So a purchase contract. This is basically, if you want to look at it in a very simple way, it's just a purchase contract. There's a purchaser and a seller, and they sell credits, and then you have various kinds of particular details with respect to those credits that need to be reflected in the agreement. You need to have provisions about delivery of those credits. What's the time scale? What's the delivery period? What is the remedy if there's any kind of delay? You need to have provisions regarding MRV plans, project validation and verification, monitoring, reporting, then as in any purchase agreement, invoicing, payment. There are reps and warranties, both from the seller and the buyer. These suppliers' warranties are obviously more important one. It depends a little bit then if a buyer is buying directly from a project developer, then the warranties would be more extensive. If the buyer is purchasing the credits from a reseller, the warranties would be more limited. Then you have all kinds of, typically all kinds of wording around environmental and safety matters, reputational matters, public announcements. And then it gets really interesting, and where you sort of need to dive into the intricacies of the carbon market. This is when we talk about reversal and leakages in the space. That can become very tricky, especially when you have long-term agreements that sometimes span over decades potentially, and then to have proper wording for, not the wording is maybe the easier part, but to think about, well, how are we going to, in case there is a reversal or a leakage in 20 or 30 years time, are these companies still going to be around? How are we going to enforce that? There are jurisdictional issues. Also, many of these agreements are cross-border. You have a project in the Global South and project developer in Europe, a buyer in the US. So you have you can have quite an intricate net of various aspects that come into play. It's really quite fascinating.
I'm curious, have you worked with carbon insurance providers?
I think carbon insurance is a critical importance really in this space to grow it, especially when, and you're exactly right, talking about reversals and leakages. Carbon insurance is going to be very important to give buyers some security in this space. I know I think you had Natalia on the show from Kita. So this is, we're talking to them, we're in contact with them, we're trying to get them involved when the deal structure is sort of right and commits to that, because I think that can facilitate a lot in mitigating those risks.
Excellent. And can you tell us about some of the more interesting partnerships you've had a role in?
Sure. Maybe just a more recent one we're working on here, which really at the beginning sort of made my head spin around a little bit, and it's taking some time to develop it. It is a forestation project in Latin America, where our client is bringing together a number of local farmers here, or forest owners, actually. And this is a very long-term agreement over 99 years. So we know that none of the participants sort of will still be around when the term expires. And it is a complex document, and you have on the other side people that are not very sophisticated in the legal environment. So you need to bridge the gap culturally on a personal interaction level, and also try to have a very as good a contract as possible. So the reason why I'm mentioning this project is because it brings together various parts of the world, a European developer with people on the ground in Latin America. We're using a New York government agreement for that, and it has property issues involved in Latin America where we need to get lawyers for. So it's a very complex and intricate project that's really it's quite fascinating, and I think quite unique at this point based on what I've seen.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Now, to perhaps take a step back and look at the grand scheme of things, I'm also curious to know your perspective on Article 6 and how important you believe it is for the development of carbon markets.
Yeah, I mean, Article 6 is a bit a land of confusion, and one could talk about Article 6 for weeks, months, and years, which is what is actually happening. I think Article 6 plays a very important role, or can play a very important role. It is highly political subject. It's very difficult to bring that many countries sort of agree on a common scheme, and we saw at the last COP that the expectations weren't met, to put it mildly. What we are doing from a practical perspective is that the discussions around Article 6 at COP are very helpful for our daily work. We get ideas, perspectives for the contracts that we're drafting. Since we are anticipating that the voluntary carbon market at some point will become regulated, and there will be a convergence between the voluntary carbon market and the compliance market at some point. We'll head that way. So whatever is being discussed on an intergovernment or an international level is very helpful for us to take points and reflect them in the agreements participating, that there will be international schemes at some point. And we want to make sure that the contracts that we develop for our clients, project developers and suppliers, that these contracts function and are eligible for schemes under Article 6. So we're watching it very closely. I think it's going to could potentially play an important role for the development of carbon markets. But it is a bit of one step forward, two steps back sometimes.
Just a quick kind of circle back to the contracts and your specific experience with them. Would you say that you could use them kind of as stepping stones with each next contract, or are they that much different from one another that you can't really borrow experience from previous contracts?
That's a great question. So the framework is always very similar. So there is a lot that we can learn from contracts we've worked with in the past, and we can, develop that further. Each project is a little bit different. Each technology is a little bit different. And there will sort of adjustments that will have to be made individually, given the particular deal structure, project or technology. But the good thing is that there are sort of core elements that we can reuse and or which we can build contracts. So it's not that we need to reinvent the wheel every time anew. There's sort of a lot of bases that we have that we can use for any kind of contract. And so we've now seen so many deals in various industries that it's relatively easy for us to amend, adjust contracts to particular circumstances.
Excellent. Now, another thing I also was very curious to learn more about from you as someone who lives in New York, the New York City carbon removal support legislation. It's a fairly unique legal framework. What can you tell us about it? And are you in any way involved in it as well?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm not directly involved, other than that I am involved in a group of volunteers here in New York that is sort of pushing legislation on a local level, because we feel very often it is easier to develop carbon removal projects on a local level and then go with that experience to state legislators and say, look what we've done here in this county. And then sort of that is a narrative that gets easily attention rather than going straight to the state senators and talk about it. It's too abstract for them. So we're trying to have grassroots little projects, tell a positive story about that, and then develop it further. That is sort of a volunteering role that I'm playing. Now, this particular legislation, it's quite simple. So the idea is, it's a very simple idea about just to give you sort of a high level overview. It incentivizes clean technology through property tax abatement. We've done this. New York has done this in other industries. Solar, green roofs, and there are basically three buckets that are being supported. One of this is direct air capture, taking carbon out of the air. The other bucket is technologies that stop CO2 from going into the atmosphere, and the third bucket is CO2 utilization, using carbon to make products. And the incentive works by means of a property tax abatement, which is can be spread over 4 or 8 years, depending on the size of the the system that's being used, the size of the property. It's capped at $100,000 a year. So it's a very simple policy, but I think it can be very effective in pushing carbon removal in New York City. And I think it is indeed the first one of its kind in that shape in the States. New York has two. So upstate New York, there are a lot of farms. So this is an area where biochar could come in a more predominant way than it currently is. And New York City is sort of the ideal, the ideal place for carbon capture. So I think New York is well situated, well placed to push these technologies.
Absolutely, yes. Actually, our previous guest on the podcast was Anna Pavlova from Carbon Quest. Right, they're also based in New York City and being decarbonized buildings in Manhattan, which is also a very fascinating space to me.
No, absolutely. I mean, Carbon Quest, they would totally benefit from that legislation. I'm pretty sure.
Well, it certainly sounds like New York City could benefit from this, and hopefully, maybe inspire other cities to follow suit.
That's the idea. Yeah, I think New York could really take a leading role. There are other states that have become maybe a bit more active. California and Massachusetts. So I think New York's got to pick it up a little bit again.
Now, well, with everything we've talked about so far in mind, and given your own invaluable experience within this sector, what do you think will be the future of carbon offsets? Do you see the market exploding, as many optimists have been saying, or would you say there's room for steady growth, or perhaps very little growth, if any?
Well, I think the predictions are the mainstream predictions are that the market's going to grow exponentially. So I'm going to go with the analysts and hoping that is the case. There is no other business model really out there for companies in that space that develop technologies other than going through the voluntary carbon market at this point. And it attracts an increasing amount of investment. So I think I'm very optimistic when it comes to the future of carbon offsets and the carbon market. I think it's going to grow. All signs are in that direction. There are also, in the US, the Department of Energy is doing a lot in pushing these kinds of technologies by incentivizing it. This builds a very positive narrative. I know that Department of Energy sometimes gets a little bit of criticism in that they only support big projects and smaller suppliers are being left on the sideline. But I think they're doing a terrific job in just getting projects out there, getting money into the market and just make it work, as compared to Europe, where there's maybe a bit of focus on regulation. In the US, it's really just, the idea is just get it out there and get it off the ground. So I think all signs are for growth.
Thank you. Peter, as my final question before we finish up, do you believe that carbon removal can generate enough supply and demand for the market to really take off?
I mean, this is a market really at its infancy. It's it's a very small market that we're talking about. And what was the size of the voluntary carbon market last year? 2.5 billion, something like that. I think the market for nail clippers is twice that size. So we're really, and 2.5 billion That's a carbon market. Carbon removal is just a fraction of that. So we have a very long way to go. And I think what's really when it's going to take off, I believe, is when we have a convergence between the voluntary market and the compliance market. I think this would be a game changer. But until then, we need to make sure that the technologies are out there and that the companies are out there that have products that allow for growth and scaling this technology to have for carbon removal to have an impact on the planet. And this is the most important role that the voluntary carbon marketplace at this stage is providing financing for startup companies in this space, so that we have the technologies ready at a scalable level for this market to really, for these technologies really to have an impact on climate.
And this convergence, you say, between the voluntary and compliance markets, do you see this happening soon?
5 to 10 years is my guess. The voluntary carbon market it's basically the Wild West in a way. There's no, and I don't think any government would be able to look at this for too long without putting some regulatory framework around it. At this point, it's just too small, and this is a bit of a dress rehearsal at the moment. Let's see how the market, is doing. What's going on? But I think in 5 to 10 years, we're going to have a very different landscape, which is going to be good, or which is going to be good for the climate, I think.
Excellent. Let's all hope so.
Yes.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing your valuable knowledge and insights with us. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, it was a pleasure to be on the show, Violet. Thanks again for having me on. Great format. Keep it up.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.